A man is not old until regret takes the place of dreams, and while dreams can be inherited, regrets cannot be, which is why the future is always made by the youth of the new era. While there are a few characters that can really exemplify this belief in fiction, Garp is the legendary hero in One Piece that is a real old G, symbolizing the golden years and a remnant of the golden age of pirating. He is a character who is not absolved of his share of regrets, but is still fueled by dreams, backed by a continued belief in the future. A theme we are heavily highlighting on this channel, the future. The world we are getting glimpses of in chapters like 1044, 1079, and most certainly chapter 1080 is something this channel has been waiting for a long time, because finally we are finding out what kind of universe Oda is creating. Today we're going to talk about why Garp's powerful introduction in chapter 1080 is so important, and why this is a power Oda has been hinting at for a long time through Garp's hidden sense of justice, but more importantly what this means for the last saga. And if you aren't paying attention to the connections, you'll be connecting with the wrong side of a galaxy fist. And so if you're new to the channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. So if you've already watched the Shanks video posted just before this, or followed this channel and the ideas that I've posted, then you would know that the power that Garp demonstrated in chapter 1080 was something that I believed in and have been waiting for, as it was one of the many ways Oda could confirm that the power creep perspective that I had for One Piece will canonically exist within the story. The belief that the powers we see in the last saga will be unimaginably greater than everything we have seen in the One Piece verse before this point in time, which led me to say things like this around chapter 1060 or right after Wano. I think Garp will have his own version of like a Bajrang gun level attack. It just doesn't make sense. Now let me clarify. I know that you pixel scalers want to point out that this galaxy impact is smaller than Bajrang Gun, but that's not the point. This punch for Garp was in the same light as Shanks' divine departure in chapter 1079. An introduction, an appetizer, a simple taste of what characters on this tier and at the highest level of the end of the story will be capable of. If this is what Garp is capable while laughing and memeing around, I wouldn't be surprised if he saw Luffy's Bajrang Gun and he wouldn't be able to pull out something to counter it, especially if you consider that this isn't even Garp's prime, a prime that in Garp's own word would be probably twice as strong as he himself said his output felt twice as slow as it used to be. There are a few characters left in the series at Garp's level and share his situation, but one of the closest people that we are familiar with would be Rayleigh, who when confronting Blackbeard felt that he couldn't match up with his old age, which to me further exemplifies why Garp is on another level. Garp has something that has carried him to this youthful age of 78 that allows him to maintain that power, and that's what I want to dissect. Unlike Whitebeard, he isn't sick. Unlike Chinzhou, he isn't living in spite. Unlike Sengoku, he isn't stuck behind a desk. And unlike Rayleigh, Garp is actively operating in the world, defending something that we'll understand more about by the end of this video. See, in the Shanks video, I emphasize that people at his level, near, or even beyond will all have a similar thematic, which is clear and indisputable resolve, which ends up being the backbone for their Haki. Because if Haki is going to be the crux of the last saga, then the resolve behind these characters' Haki has to be incredibly important. They will demonstrate a resolve that no other character has demonstrated, and that's where we land on the very next chapter, proving that point with Garp, a character that is more resolved than most people on his side of the world. But what is Garp resolved towards? That is something Oda has actually hidden from us. Even in his Vivre card, he labeled Sengoku and Suru's sense of justice as reigning justice and cleansing justice, respectively. The admirals all have their own sense of justice, and given Garp's role as the legendary hero of the Marines, isn't it wild that we don't know what his sense of justice is? I think answering that will also help us understand why his resolve is so strong, and is reflected in his massive Haki output in chapter 1080. So let's understand who Garp is and what kind of character he is. Garp, again, the legendary hero of the Marines, is first and foremost a vice admiral in the Navy, but he is noted to be far more powerful than his rank, and we always knew that he was a character who was at minimum at the admiral caliber, which was later supported when Sengoku told us that Garp turned down the offer to become an admiral, where we also learn of an incredibly interesting detail about Garp, the reason why he refuses to ascend rank in the organization he loves, loves is because the duties of an admiral rank binds him directly to the protection of celestial dragons who he loathes. But isn't that ironic that since the Navy is the military force of the world government that essentially stands as an oppressive force to protect the celestial dragons hierarchy, it seems counterintuitive that a proud man like Garp, who is seen as the symbol of the Navy, wouldn't support his main benefactors. So why is he doing this? On top of that, why is he trying to encourage the youth to join his side, from Luffy to Ace to now Koby? Well, Garp tells us an important clue in chapter 956. He explains that while the Reverie is inefficient and often creates more chaos than it solves, specifically he says how many kings can actually speak equally for both their own people and others, which might be important insight for later on, but all of this speech culminating to the admission of what Garp sees as peace, or more accurately the bare minimum Garp needs to see to recognize peace, which is, as long as no blood is spilled, I'm willing to call it peace. I think we can all take a step back and understand how flawed that judgment is for determining peace. Under that authority, crimes like slavery and discrimination will flourish simply by an unbalanced system. Garp could look at Dressrosa and turn a blind eye, which we know is the case because the first foreshadows towards Dressrosa was the auction house on Sabaody, which he acknowledges but turns a blind eye to, which allowing for all of this is so awful. How can he possibly be a good character if this is the kind of justice he enacts? I think to understand this side of Garp, we probably have to look at the conversation he had with King Neptune and Shirahoshi as an understanding that while he may be powerful, he cannot solve that problem about how kingdoms and their leaders can't possibly care about themselves and others at the same time. Which, if you take those two notions here about not spilling blood equating to peace and an understanding that leadership around the world being inherently flawed, you get an interesting creation in Dragon, Monkey D. Dragon, who is Garp's son, and as we know anything about families is that you can learn a lot about someone by who raised them or who they raised, and in this case it's interesting because we kind of get both sides, because in two places we see Ivankov say that Luffy was similar to Dragon, using the phrase that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and I almost think it's kind of ironic because if you apply that to Dragon and Garp, it's an even funnier statement. Dragon, back in the ASL flashback in Goa Kingdom, admits that he does not have the power currently to make the changes he wants, and if you flash forward to how he is changing the world now, it's through empowering countries to put leaders that hopefully will care about one another, which is one side of what Garp saw as flaws within the nations at the Reverie. But also we recently found out that Dragon used to have the freedom fighters and was a pacifist, which might have been a value instilled by the ideal that Garp stated about not wanting to spill blood for the sake of peace. But then because of Ohara, it seems that Dragon switched his sense of justice to the ideology that backs the Revolutionary Army, which summarizes to empowering others to seek freedom for themselves, which as an apple falls very far from the Navy tree, and Luffy as a pirate also fell far from both the Revolutionary and Navy tree. But while that may be true on the surface, there is a way more important tree that serves as the roots for the monkey family, and that would be the tree of freedom. Underlying all of these crazy characters is the desire for freedom. Luffy is literally embodying the warrior of liberation, Dragon is liberating nations from oppression, and Garp is also doing the same thing. He actually pushes for freedom, which again sounds ironic considering the jacket he wears. But don't just take my word for it. In Garp's fever card, Oda says that freedom is what Garp seeks, and as an added notion, the Vice Admiral rank gives him the most freedom and allows him to avoid the freedom takers, the Celestial Dragons. In the grand scheme of things, Garp isn't actually choosing the wrong path. When he started in the Marines, there weren't many other options to protect people. The revolutionaries didn't exist, and in terms of piracy, pirates like Luffy and Roger are anomalies. But what's really interesting is that unlike Shanks and pirates in general, we've never seen Garp actually badmouth his son Dragon, who is proclaimed to be the world's worst criminal. Like, Garp has taken potshots at Ace while the boy was chained up in prison, calling him a scallywag, but not a single time has Garp mentioned any disdain for Dragon or the Revolutionary Army. Which, when you really think about it, he should hate the Revolutionary Army. They are essentially an organized terror group that is actively working to take down the world government and navy, while pirates are just a disjointed operation that from our perspective just disrupt normal peace at varying levels. And that point is really important because it tells you why Garp is doing what he is doing. Garp wants the world to change, but wants that change to happen as peacefully as possible. And the Revolutionary Army actually operates in a more peaceful manner, it seems, exhibited by a strong example in Lucia. Though it was liberated, they held the king and princess captive, but not necessarily imprisoned or worse, killed like you would normally see of many forceful coups d'etats even in our world. So then what in the world is Garp defending? What is the world Garp wants to see? And for that, let's take a look at how Garp was introduced to us and see for ourselves what Garp has been up to. So interestingly enough, there's two separate introductions to Garp. One where we didn't know who he was, and the second when Luffy meets him after becoming a pirate himself. And I want to highlight the chapter titles that Oda chose as well. So in chapter 92, titled Happiness, is when we get our first glimpse at Vice Admiral Garp. We see Garp in the cover story series that covers how Koby ends up joining the Marines, and the process of how all of this goes down is an interesting note that we'll get to in a little bit. But let's talk about chapter 431, titled Fist of Love, the chapter where Garp finally reveals himself to be Luffy's grandpa, saying the Fist of Love cannot be blocked. In the following chapter, he appears with his full name and appearance. He claims Luffy as his grandson and even more, Dragon as his son. A chapter where we see that Garp is hurt to see that Luffy became a pirate, blaming Shanks for tainting Luffy's path. But Luffy defends his pride in Shanks, proclaiming that Shanks saved his life. Garp showed his pride as a Navy man and Luffy's as a pirate, and thereafter we see Garp unveil his own pride in Koby and Helmeppo, whom he essentially adopted in the chapter 92 cover story, wanting to essentially see his children measure up against each other. Then not too far after, in chapter 438 titled Pride, which we'll talk about more at the very end of this video, we see Garp demonstrating how insanely powerful he is, while still refusing to deny his familial connection to Luffy the pirate. And the overall point being that Oda has not only tied Garp to pride, love, and happiness, but I think that's also what makes Garp so powerful. I think those are the key factors in Garp's impressive power despite his old age, which I think pride specifically is a little ironic for Garp. Garp being prideful sounds weird because he doesn't even take pride in his shining life achievement that resulted in him being called the hero of the Marines at the legendary God Valley event, which if you think it's because God Valley is a secret, I recommend going to check out my Fraud Valley video. But anyways, Garp still has a lot of pride. In fact, one of the main times we see Garp happy is when he hears updates about Luffy. No matter what Luffy does, Garp shows that he is proud of Luffy despite his best friend Sengoku's obvious annoyance. Whether it was taking down a warlord, destroying Eni's lobby, or breaking out of Impel Down with a bunch of prisoners in tow, Garp has not been angry a single time, despite how this is obviously bad for the Navy. He even explicitly expresses how proud he is of his grandson. He always prioritizes his love first and honestly seems like he doesn't even care about taking prisoners. I mean, Dadan is a criminal that he gave an ultimatum to take care of his family or he'd put her in prison instead. Even when we were introduced to Garp in the cover story, the resolution of the story was Captain Morgan's escaping and Helmeppo and Koby returning safely with him. We know full well he could have taken down Captain Morgan's at any point, even while he was, quote, escaping. It's more accurate to say Garp let him escape, or even more importantly, Garp prioritized something else. I think he was testing Koby. He sensed something in Koby that might have been the same thing that Luffy sensed, and it was demonstrated in what Koby did during the cover story. The Marines left to deal with the situation, including Bogard, decided to try and shoot down Captain Morgan, which would include Helmeppo as collateral casualty. And while Koby and Helmeppo weren't friends by this point, Koby defended them with his body. He stood in front of a cannon trying to protect the lives of honestly both of them. But Koby demonstrated something interesting here, an understanding that death was not an appropriate reaction to their crimes. Killing a criminal was not worth it, especially at the risk of innocent life. But in all honesty, I think Koby would have protected Morgan as well. This sense of justice was what Garp saw or felt or sensed in Koby that made him put his beliefs in him. The man that proclaimed his protege Koby, the future of the Navy in chapter 1080. Koby is what Garp is proud of, and this is after Koby demonstrated another amazing defense that ended the Marineford War. In fact, you could even say Koby did what Garp wanted to do. Garp with his standing was stuck in a tough place, but Koby, his protege, stood in front of arguably one of the strongest people at Marineford, staking his morals into the ground where his 2 feet were planted, hoping to create a few seconds for people to come to their senses. And when you understand why Koby did what he did there, it was for the sake of innocent lives while sacrificing his own. Koby was displaying his own sense of justice that was mentored by Garp. And when we look a little deeper at Koby's motive here, we might actually see what Garp's sense of justice is. See, on top of the lives that Koby wanted to save, all the voices he was hearing and bodies dropping were sending him into a spiral, and this was his inner monologue. Each and every soldier has a family waiting for him at home. Koby was thinking of the families. Behind every soldier and every human being is a family. And I can't help but think this value that Koby was protecting was instilled by Garp, because I think Garp's sense of justice is familial justice, or fatherly justice. When you look back at what Garp was proud of and refused to deny, despite how much of a stain it was on his career, it was his family. He was proud of Luffy to no ends. Garp also showed that anybody could be family. He took in Ace and showed him love, which we'll talk about in a bit. And Luffy being his grandson is an important one for sure, but then there's Koby, another child that he took in, and clearly by the showing in chapter 1080 demonstrates that Garp will protect Koby like family. And that might sound awkward when you take Marineford into consideration, but we have to acknowledge the obvious difficulties the situation brought to him. While Ace was a criminal pirate, he was still family, and that made Garp extremely conflicted. That was the same thing when it came to confronting Luffy there. While he was in the right, while he was defending what seems to be his pride, the Navy, we see him falter in resolve against Luffy, giving Luffy the opportunity to hit him despite him being fully capable of halting Luffy's progression. And we see Sengoku confirm our suspicions. Garp chose to be a father before being a Navy man. Garp in this moment showed what he truly upheld and what he truly wanted to defend all of this time. It was family. See, while that sounds like a narrow sense of justice and an awful one at that, it really makes more sense when you realize that Garp was willing to treat everyone like family, which means killing was off the table, which meant absolute justice like that of Akainu was not the way, which is why we see when Akainu pulls the trigger on Ace and almost Luffy, Garp wanted to end his life, but understanding that Akainu did his job. But what I'm really trying to get at here is that I think Garp believes people should handle conflicts as if they are a family, and that behind every person who you go to war with is countless families that will suffer as a result. Because that reflects the two things that Garp said about peace and justice. When you think about family, no matter how much fighting they have, they almost never kill each other, and they are willing to tolerate so much for the sake of a blood bond. Siblings fight all the time, and parents, even the worst ones, still have a soft spot for their children. And even in the extreme examples with Doflamingo, we see how much conflict and hesitation there was when it came to betraying family. But in normal cases, no matter how much bickering there is between brothers, they at the end of the day are still brothers. When Garp says as long as no blood is spilt, it's called peace, if you put that in the context of how a family would resolve conflict, then it makes more sense. And on top of that, when he says how can a king speak equally for their own people and others, it makes sense from a familial standpoint. If people treated each other as if they had a family behind them, maybe they could. Maybe they'd have a better understanding of how to speak equally for others. But people, especially in times of conflict, forget the humanity behind every soul that might be lost. Every lost soul translates to a family that is now broken because of it. One death impacts at minimum one mother, and at maximum theoretically the entire world. That's how much we should care. And we see a glimpse of that with Ace's death. When Garp chose his duty before Ace, he forgot about Fuchsia Village. village. Dadon's rage with every punch is what's created every time someone dies. That's why Garp's familial sense of justice is so powerful, and it also makes so much sense for him, especially when you consider who he respected in the world. With this perspective, that makes Whitebeard probably the most unfortunate opponent for Garp, because Whitebeard also practiced what Garp preached. Whitebeard treated nearly everyone in his life like family. Even when Squard betrayed him, he instantly forgave him thereafter. When you think of it, yeah, Whitebeard was willing to go to war for Ace, but what if the world government wasn't going to execute Ace, and treated him not necessarily with humanity, but just like any other prisoner? I wonder if Whitebeard would have mobilized the same way had the Navy not announced Ace's execution. And we take a step back, it makes sense that Whitebeard, Garp, and even Roger were all like this. They all had mutual respect for each other while being technically opposed to each other. We see this familial thematic behind all of them, the ability to clash with each other without killing each other. But even more than that, we see Roger understanding this sense of justice within Garp when he asked him to take in Ace. He says a child does not carry the sins of their parents, but the world government doesn't see it like that. And that is another instance where Garp betrayed the world government when he decided to treat Roger like a father instead of a criminal. And Garp mutually understood that even while being a person in the Navy, the way Roger defended his friends as if they were irreplaceable family was something that Garp himself could not help but respect. Why? Because it was something that he resonates with. And so when it comes to Garp and the power we see in chapter 1080, it's Garp, the legendary hero of the Marines with a fist of love that is backed by familial justice. The resolve it takes to be a man in a system that does not support your values, but wishing to change it from within is incredible. This inner turmoil is there. When it comes to your own family, you act differently. In the scene where Sengoku, Ace, and Garp are on the execution altar, Sengoku asks if Garp has any second thoughts. Garp says no. We're fighting pirates here. There's no reason to show them any mercy. Outlaws deserve no mercy. But this is family. What am I supposed to do? And then he pleaded with Ace one last time with tears in his eyes, asking, Ace, why didn't you live the way I told you to? And that was ultimately Garp's solution. If his family joined the Navy, he could protect them the way he probably protected Aokiji, which refers to whatever favor Aokiji owes Garp for, probably for covering up the blunder at Ohara with Robin's escape. The way he is protecting Koby right now is another example in chapter 1080. It's the way he wishes he could protect the rest of his family. But not just that, children all over. Garp seems to have a soft spot for any kid, even the worst criminal's kid, which is what Roger exploited. And this same soft spot was probably the reason why Garp had to act at God Valley. He was trying to protect the children there because the power of his resolve comes from protecting the youth. Whether it's familial justice or fatherly justice, that's where I think Garp's power comes from. Even when he disciplines you, it's out of love. Luffy loves his grandpa but still is terrified of him because Garp is still strict with him. But even though Luffy was a pirate, Garp could still stand in the same room as Luffy because while he was a duty-bound Navy man, he treated this pirate with love. And the thing is, he treats everyone with love, from Koby and Helmeppo to even Dadon, who said a lot of what Luffy said. Though she was a bandit, she was grateful for not going to prison but felt like dealing with Garp was a little bit worse than just going to jail. But I'd bet that though Ace, Luffy, and Sabo were all intolerable monsters, she loved being their foster mother. Without Garp allowing this resolution, she wouldn't have developed the strong emotions that brought her to punch Garp after Ace's death. And what's even more, Garp allowed it. Allowing a criminal to take retribution on him was the least he could do because he understood she was doing it out of love for her family, his family, their family, and at the end of the day, everyone has a family. The absolute justice that Akainu and other Marines live by does not see the world in the same light as Garp does. And that's where Ace's line about how the Navy treats families is probably the most ironic thing for Garp. Ace, while chained and impaled down, tells Garp the fact that we, meaning him and Luffy, have world-class criminal blood flowing through our veins. There's no way we could ever have been accepted into the Navy. If you recontextualize this for Garp, he is a D-clan. His son is the world's worst criminal, and grandson is Straw Hat Luffy, and Garp is still perfectly fine in the Navy. Sengoku even says, if you weren't called the Navy's hero, I'd make you pay for the sins of your entire family. And Garp responds that his life isn't worth nearly enough. And when you take a step back, if Luffy liberated Alabasta or Dressrosa as a Navy man, he probably would be celebrated in the same way as Garp. I mean, Smoker and Fujitora took his credit simply because they were Navy and that was their job. And when you look at any of the other Navy men, there's not a single person who has demonstrated the same resolve to protect their family, personal values, and others all at the same time. The conflict that Garp feels while being respected as the Navy's greatest soldier is something I think Oda really wanted us to feel and understand, especially given by how he introduced Garp, standing opposite of the Navy man who is trying to do much of the same thing. Captain Morgan is a crazy foil of a Navy man father who kind of is similar to Garp, but gained respect out of fear and duty rather than love. And you can see this in his dialogue from chapter 4. Obviously, take what I'm saying with a logical mindset that this isn't exactly how you should be a parent, but let me paint some of these parallels. Helmeppo complains that Luffy hit him and that no one has ever hit him, not even his father. And Captain Morgan said, "Do you know why I never hit you?" Helmeppo goes, "Because I'm your beloved son." And Captain Morgan responds, "No, it's because you're not even worth hitting," which runs complete opposite to Garp and Luffy, who while Garp hit and basically traumatized Luffy, it was done with the fist of love. It's because he loved Luffy that he disciplined him. And Luffy knows that. While scared of Garp, he knows Garp loves him more than anything. But also the self-worth part that comes next is very important. Morgan says Helmeppo isn't the great one. He himself is the great one, which Garp never did to Luffy. While Garp could easily say that since he was the hero of the Marines, and the irony of what comes next is crazy. Morgan gave the order to a lieutenant to kill Rika for feeding Zoro, and the Navy guy defied his order and said he couldn't obey such a cruel order. And Morgan says, "You are a lieutenant in the Navy," and since Morgan's is a superior officer, they are duty bound to obey him. He basically kills the man for a mutiny and says that everyone needs to be taught respect, which if you compare this to Garp, one, Garp would never order someone to kill as he himself has never really done that. Two, it seems Garp teaches all of his subordinates to follow a personalized sense of justice that allows them to betray the Navy's orders countless times. And three, Garp acts in a way where the respect isn't taught, it's earned. And we're not done, because what Morgan says after feels like it was written expressly to run contrast to Garp. Morgan says, "For years I labored to achieve this rank, and I did it by my own strength, at great personal cost. Rank means everything in this world, remember that. My rank is the highest on this base, which makes me superior to everyone else, where that means everything I do is right," which everyone gets the message, proclaiming him to be the greatest. And then we turn to Morgan's looking at his statue and saying, "This is a monument to my rank and my power. It took years to build, but today it is finally complete. Raise my statue, put it at the highest point of this fortress as a symbol of my greatness." This entire page was literally written, in my opinion, to make the irony heavier when Garp was introduced, essentially contrasting this man. Garp is a more legitimate version of Morgan. Garp has reached the highest rank but refused it. Rank to him does not mean everything in the world. Family and freedom are held higher. Garp actually is superior to most other Marines, sometimes even admirals in my opinion, because he is the hero of the Marines. And he knows everything he does is not right, but it's right to him. But despite Garp having the recognition where it actually makes sense to make a monument, Garp refuses to make himself a symbol of greatness because he doesn't care even an iota about that. And even more so, we see Garp actually working with his squad, rebuilding a wall he ordered them to fix, which again is a complete opposite to Morgan. To summarize it, Morgan is a man who ruled with an axe of fear, while Garp is a man that rules with a fist of love. Morgan is a man who feels his own son is worthless, while Garp has demonstrated that you can even be a criminal and feel his love, and going to war for someone who isn't even his son. Morgan is a man who would never let someone beneath him touch him, especially not Helmeppo, but Garp allowed Luffy to disrespect him even in front of the entire world. And most importantly, Morgan is the kind of man who would threaten his own son's life for the sake of his escape, whereas Garp is the kind of man who would die protecting his family and his own people. And that's ultimately why I think Oda wrote Garp to be this way. Garp maintains his power because he lives a life without regret, because he is proud of the world he fathered. The old generation, this generation, and the new generation, everything we have seen was partially shaped by Garp. Without Garp, it honestly would have been a much scarier place. While Roger created the golden age of piracy and Whitebeard maintained it, Garp was a primary figure in creating the balance that countered it. Garp is proud of the peace he protects, but also proud of the people he has inspired. His dream of familial peace will be pushed forward by the people he treated like family. Every father yearns for the day they become a grandfather, and with that comes a future that, in Garp's own words, is beyond imagination. He is the past and he will give his life for that future. So when we look at Garp as an old man and denounce his power because he is way past his prime, we have to acknowledge he has something immeasurable behind him. Every punch will carry the weight of Garp's entire life behind it. If you stand in front of this man, it means taking on the era of rocks, the golden age, and the most important thing to Garp, the new era. When Garp fights now, it will be backed with the pride of a father protecting his children, arguably one of the scariest things to exist besides a mother's rage. And the thing is, we saw how far a father would go in Whitebeard. If you touched his kids, the strongest man would and could destroy the world if it meant protecting the world he raised. Both Whitebeard and Garp learned a lesson when they lost their beloved child Ace, and we see Garp not hesitating this time with Koby. We see a laughing Garp create a punch named Galaxy Impact, and so I wouldn't be surprised if a more serious Garp who is pushed into a corner to protect his world brings out moves like Supernova Slam or Big Bang Collision. These will be the moves that overshadow everything else we have seen thus far. These level of attacks come from people that are protecting a world with dreams and desires that bring them unshakable resolve. There seems to be a thematic around these worlds that gets tied to regret, parenthood, aging, and bad timelines. Because while the three strongest men all essentially fathered a new world, they were also fathers to Ace. Roger may regret not being there for Ace, Whitebeard regrets not protecting him, and Garp regrets not putting Ace first. Their regrets won't be passed on, but their dreams will. Roger, Whitebeard, and Garp all have their dreams converge on Luffy, which is what makes this last saga even more exciting when you realize that Oda is doing something incredible here. Oda wanted the two men who were duty bound not to their careers, but rather their families, to fall to the same man. The man who had no family, who when given a family used their family to rise up, stepping on them, throwing them away, backstabbing them, and even killing them, and ultimately murdered the man who gave him everything. Yes, we are talking about Blackbeard. If Garp is a man who is resolved by his family and that's where his willpower comes from, then Blackbeard is literally the best written way to end Garp's life, whether it's now or later. A black hole that will destroy any father's universe. Blackbeard is the type of character that knows how to exploit a parental figure's weakness. He did it with Whitebeard and he will do it with Garp. In fact, the moment he realizes Koby's importance, I'm sure he will abuse it. Moments like when Higurashi imitated Momo come to mind, especially since Blackbeard has Katarina Devon. If they transformed into Ace, Luffy, Sabo, Koby, Helmeppo even, Garp will falter. Garp already faltered when it came to Ace despite how resolved he was. Remember, Garp had all the power to free Ace and didn't, despite him wanting to. And that same conflict when it comes to dealing with Luffy was witnessed witnessed by Blackbeard. When Garp saw Luffy and actually went to go fight him, Garp pulled away. The moment of weakness towards his family that the world saw there is something Blackbeard definitely took note of. While Blackbeard might not seem like he could measure up to the power that Garp demonstrated in chapter 1080, you might be surprised because that's actually what the next video is going to be about. But at the same time, the strongest men in One Piece did not fall to pure power. I mean, Whitebeard technically didn't even fall, but he took on so much pain while already dying at the hands of his own values. Roger died to illness, Odin died to deceit, and Garp will probably die to all of the above. The illness called love that will be used to make Garp fall on his own values at the hands of the man who is devious enough to exploit it. And I say devious enough because when you really look at basically every post-time skip villain, they were all protecting something. It was their families. Hody wanted to protect his people. Doflamingo had huge family values that stemmed from his original family failures, which allowed him to overlook Corazone's betrayal for a long time. Big Mom is literally a big family, and even Kaido protected his crew like a family, especially evident when you look at his connections to Jack and King. Like Garp said, everyone naturally protects their own people. Garp is doing much of the same, but Blackbeard is specifically the character that cares so little about everyone else. He contradicts even Garp's normal purview of people. We saw this recently on Amazon Lily, where he seemed to show the lack of care for the survival of his crew. Blackbeard killed Thatch for the Yami Yami no Mi on top of that, and basically executed Ace so that he could become a warlord, get a crew, and ultimately put Whitebeard into a situation where he could also kill him for his fruit. Blackbeard is willing to throw away family to achieve his ambitions, whereas Garp is the man willing to protect family to the end of time. When these ideals clash, I see Oda creating a world where Blackbeard breaks another parent, and Luffy will be the one to carry the dreams of every person that passed through him, wipe away every regret, and ultimately fulfill the dreams by overcoming the antagonist that runs counter to every part of Luffy's existence. The black hole that destroys all of the worlds will be offset by the sun god that will ultimately create the new era that'll become the home for so many new dreams that were built on the foundation of the dreams of the people that allowed it to exist. And so that explains a few things when it comes to Garp and why he is one of the most important characters in the series, and thematically makes sense why he can display the kind of power in chapter 1080. The resolve behind his Haki makes sense, and like I said in the Shanks video, if you were wondering why these characters are randomly this much stronger than anything we have seen before, it's because of the mental aspect that Oda wrote in for these characters. These are characters that were willing to endure loss and pain for others, and even willing to sacrifice themselves for it. In a lot of ways, you could say Shanks giving up his arm, which was his pride that allowed him to rival Mihawk, was how he solidified his resolve in defending the new era that allowed him to reach the levels of Haki we see from him. And similarly, we see Garp constantly sacrificing his pride in the Navy for the sake of his family and defending the future of the Navy. Both of these characters aren't just fighting for their morals. They aren't just fighting the present, they are protecting the future. And with these ambitions and the strength to enforce it, we will see characters like them demonstrate powers on this level and even greater. And there's one other connection in power between Shanks in 1079 and Garp in 1080 that I want to mention, but before I get there, if you enjoyed this video, consider liking, subscribing, and even sharing. I think this perspective will be important to really understand the last saga, as this kind of thinking is what allowed me to properly predict the power creep that we see from Shanks and Garp, and what I expect everyone else to feel like. And apparently about 50% of my video viewers are not even subscribed, so if you want more content like this, definitely consider supporting. And another way to support not just me but the artists who help me is on my website. I am selling stickers, shirts, and other merch that will have the raw versions of the custom art used in the thumbnails. So if you like this video's thumbnails or any of the other ones, be sure to check out my website and get some of the dopest artwork in the community. The one I'm most excited for is the Elemental Haki thumbnail, which is a video coming out very soon, and that's actually the last thing I wanted to talk about. See, the thing a lot of people forget is that in 1079, while what Shanks showed us is incredible, it's not his upper limit. I think that one way or another, he saved Kid from fatal damage, just like how Mihawk saved Zoro from fatal damage. Characters at the top are capable of that kind of restraint, it seems, which makes sense. When you're that much more powerful than your enemy, you can afford to be lenient while still be domineering. That being said, with Garp's feat, I think that this galaxy impact might only damage the people he wants to damage. We see a giant impact bubble that destroys all of these buildings, but his team was located there. And the amazing thing about Haki is you can choose what you damage. This was exemplified through Rayleigh's words about Conqueror's Haki, but also swordsmanship. You can will what you cut, and the best swordsmen can cut nothing if they choose to. I think Garp using a Haki blast like this means that this Haki blast will only incapacitate the people he wants to. I think this will be shown directly or indirectly, but that's honestly a little bit of a stretch that I wanted to insert before mentioning the most important thing. Shanks also is canonically able to create a fiery sword, but hasn't shown it, and I explained that a little bit more in the previous Shanks video. And similarly, I think Garp is hiding an elemental power too. And the emphasis point that I think especially now people can understand is that in chapter 1079 and 1080, you can understand that Oda is putting a focal point on Haki and willpower, and those two things are affected by emotions. And that's why I think the last saga will contain elemental Haki, basically elemental based powers that manifest based off of your emotions. This isn't a new concept, but rather a concept that started with the first major theory I made on my channel, that I portrayed throughout nearly every single one of my videos, that there is a huge emotional aspect that Oda has laid underneath the main storyline. So much so that the first movie he wrote was an emotional movie that he decided not to release, called Crystal Log Pose. We see that reiterated when it comes to the desire thematic on Egghead that was overlaid by the emotionless excursion cover story saga that lasted over a year. And that relays back to my Sanji video, where I explain a lot about the importance of why emotions are super important to dissect in One Piece, but also why Sanji has gotten highlighted so much so given his emotional aspect. And while Sanji may have Lunarian DNA, the fire powers might have a source that ties in with every other character in One Piece with non-Devil Fruit fire powers, because surely they all can't be related to Lunarians. And that comes to Shanks. Unless you want Shanks to be part Lunarian, it is canon that he can conjure up flames using his sword. And so because of the elemental Haki theory, I think that in chapter 1080, Garp also displayed elemental Haki in a very subtle way that was honestly one of the coolest parts of the chapter. See, something that I instantly understood in my live reaction that a lot of people ended up seeing as well in chapter 1080 was that the ship that Garp was on had to be jettisoned into the air by Garp. Now, a lot of people even now don't see it, but I implore them to look at the back of the ship and explain how this ship got into the sky. It doesn't have a rocket booster like the Thousand Sunny, and the joke that I made was that Garp saw Luffy escape in Water 7 and just wanted to recreate that. But also, in my opinion, a lot of people are incorrectly assuming that Garp threw the ship. But then for that, you are implying that Garp got in the water, threw the ship, jumped off the water, and got back on the masthead, which is interesting, but Garp isn't even shown to be wet, so he had to use a Haki blast or a punch. But the problem with that is that we see what a Haki blast looks like. That's what it would end up doing. And the thing is, we see the ship right after it takes off, and there's nothing like that. And yeah, maybe he used a punch, but the thing is, we know Garp doesn't have just normal punches. They are Haki punches, and that's where we go back to his famous punch, the Fist of Love. I believe that is what he used here. See, it sounds crazy, but I told so many people that Garp would have wind power, which is what the Thousand Sunny uses to fly, compressed air. But the idea is again something I said from the very beginnings of my channel, that Garp and mainly Dragon would have wind related powers. And while I didn't connect this dot initially with Garp, something I will expand on later but summarize right now, I believe that Dragon, while he may have a Zoan fruit or something, I believe the storm or wind powers that people think he has stems from Haki, wind Haki, elemental Haki specifically, elemental Haki to be precise. While I'll expand on this in a future video, if I had to be surgically precise right now with my words, I would say that I think his Haki is based on freedom. And to let you guys in on a secret, it's not something that just Dragon has. He was able to teach Sabo Dragon Breath, a wind-based attack that seemed to be tied to Haki, as it resembles Zoro's way of thinking. Also, Ivankov winks their eyes and is able to create pressurized air as well. This pressurized air was one way or another used in Logtown and Goa Kingdom in Dragon's presence. And now with Garp, I think the way he propelled the ship out of the water was with wind Haki. Why do I say that? Well, if he loves justice, if he loves his family, if he loves Koby, and he wants freedom, we come to one of the most mysterious lines about East Blue. It's that love is a hurricane. This was tied to the East Blue, where the monkey family is from, and it just so happens that the only real explanation for Garp's ship to be flying is wind, but also goes back to something Sanji said about Garp in Garp's introduction. Sanji, being a man who is the crux of my elemental Haki theory and also is super emotionally adept, said that Garp felt like a whirlwind, which I get is a romanticized way to describe someone who has a whimsical presence, but if Shanks has elemental Haki, or the ability to conjure up elements through Haki, I wouldn't doubt that Garp can do the same thing. It might even be that Luffy will be fire and wind primarily, but this will all be something that I expand on in my remastered elemental Haki theory, and in the meantime, if you are unaware of the theory, I put a playlist of all the relevant theories in the description box below, so be sure to check it out. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.